Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate you taking the time. As I mentioned, let's start with a short version of how you come to the perspective you come from. I mean, why you do what you do, a brief tour of the history of you that leads you to the passion, insight, and intention behind the work you do.
Certainly. I'm a former teacher of kids with emotional behavioral problems from the Midwest, and early on in my career, I became aware of the fact that about a third to a half of my kids had probation officers. They were in my class because they had mental health problems, but the fact that they were involved in the juvenile justice system really kind of made me think about the connections between the various systems that are concerned about respond to the needs of youth. And that was about 25 years ago. And since then, through my work, I've kind of gotten more interested in issues related to mental health, juvenile justice, school failure. And so probably for the last 15 or so years, I've been involved in monitoring juvenile corrections facilities, advocating on behalf of kids who are incarcerated, particularly kids with disabling conditions like learning disabilities, mental retardation, emotional and behavioral disorders. So it's really, it's kind of an evolution. And personally, and this may be consistent with some of your biases on the basis of what I've read, there really seems to be, the action is really on the margins where kind of systems of thought come together. And so if you think about reading failure, for example, it's not this independent entity that's just kind of out there that just affects what happens in school. It really has ramifications throughout kids' lives. That's the Cliff Notes version. Is that
That's perfect.
Okay.
That was a jewel.
Okay.
Actually, let me get this. Let me keep over it. I mean, obviously, your work encompasses a lot more than that connection with reading. Let me give you kind of a takeoff ramp from how we see what's going on that you can kind of build from. Our sense is that children experience an artificial form of confusion, a form of confusion that's artificial to the organism, human being organism. And that the context with which they experience this confusion causes them to feel like there's something wrong with them because they're confused. That elicits shame. The more that this happens, the lower the threshold of a triggering shame.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The more that it triggers shame, like anything else human beings are ashamed of, the less we want to be doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so the consequence is that and a miscontextualized, misinstructed, artificial form of confusion is causing a significant dimension of our population of children to grow up with a kind of pre-conscious shame aversion to the feeling of confusion, and it's decapitating their abilities to learn in certain domains. And that absent that kind of, robbed of that kind of health as a consequence of this, that leads them open to all kinds of other difficulties and problems. So in our last conversation, one of the things that you did was relay some conversations that you've had with kids, the juveniles in the system, and your sense of how, for example, one of the key phrases that you used was "better bad than dumb."
Right.
Remember that?
Yeah.
So maybe you could speak to that point.
Sure. Well, my experience as a teacher and as a teacher trainer has really been that in many school settings, when kids are not capable of performing to some standard in the classroom, that it's really not socially acceptable to be ignorant and to not know the appropriate response. However, among one's peers, it is okay to be a bad boy, or typically boy, to kind of act out and to kind of get the other kids to laugh. And so that the class clown may in fact be in part covering up his inadequacy to perform to some academic standard. And I think that's, that's played out in the streets as well. We all think that being incarcerated, getting locked up, is such a stigmatizing thing. And for some kids it certainly is. But there's a pretty big segment of kids for whom it's a badge, and not a negative one. I've been to, and fill in the blank, state training school, whatever it is. And I think it's just it's an extension of that. It's better to be bad than to be dumb.
Associating pride with something that,
It's something that the rest of us consider to be so negative. And I think some of the kids are surprised once they do get locked up. But I think for the most part, once you're out, if you haven't been in too long, it's a sign of status.
So, I have some questions along the lines of our last conversation, but I'm also interested, as much as we have the time for kind of a free exchange. You understand where we're coming from.
Right.
What we're trying to do is to really paint we talked to the Kids Risk Program, the people at Harvard. We've had a conversation with Child Trends. We're basically trying to say to America, hey, wake up. This is an unnatural, artificially confusing challenge that a significant part of our population is shaming out on, and it's diminishing their life. Right. And if you look at the things kids are at risk for today, along the list, you put them all together, they're all dwarfed by the probability that a child's going to have trouble here.
Right.
And that trouble has consequences.
Oh, dire consequences. Absolutely.
To our society, to each individual, and to our society as a whole. To each individual, it fundamentally affects their relationship with himself, which then leads to all kinds of social pathological gateways, and ends up costing us all enormously.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's the spectrum of
the
framework. You can pick some points along that where you think there's good connectivity between your work, your research, your experience with children, your worldview that kind of fits anywhere on that framework for us to engage.
Sure. Well, let's see, I had a thought a moment ago. I guess it was about the sense of connectedness that kids have. And I think early on in children's school careers, they develop this sense that they're capable and competent, or that they're not. And I think it in subsequent experiences, that sometimes that negative sense is really reinforced. I guess one of the concerns that I have is that most of our analyses and a lot of the research that we do is really is kind of a micro level analysis, for lack of a better term. We talk about the child and his or her failures. So we describe the topography of their behavior. We might describe the settings in which it takes place, but our analysis does not really get at what is it about the systems within which children find themselves. What is it about the schools? What is it about the communities? One of the things that I'm terribly concerned about, particularly in low to moderate income communities, is the sense that the schools have not adapted to meet the needs of the families that are there. And let me explain that. For example, a lot of the schools operate on the assumption that the parents are all salaried, and if they're called in the middle of the day, a parent can just kind of jump out in the car and drive over and kind of help solve the problem. Or that there are two breadwinners, one who's working and one who isn't. And that there's that flexibility. Many families, single-parent families as well as two breadwinner families, are wage earners. And so kind of punching out, stepping out of the shop to do something has real consequences on the business. And it's the unusual school, it's the rare school that provides flex time for its staff to meet with parents during the time that's convenient for them, as opposed to between 9 and 4. So that's just a small example.
It recognizes that the parents probably have or could have literacy problems, and sending notes home as a mode of exchange with them rather than calling them on the phone or Otherwise arranging, like you're saying, to engage.
Oh, exactly. That's a good example. Exactly. They make a set of assumptions about, and then when the parents don't participate, the assumption is, well, they don't care about the children. Well, that's just not true. They just have many other demands, and you're expecting them to respond in ways that they're not capable of responding, either because of language, because of inability to read. There's a lot of different things that may be going on.
Yeah, we talked extensively with Tim Shanahan and other people in education about some of these more general and misorientations or inefficient orientations in the way the overall system behaves. We focus on reading because it's a very unique and distinct kind of challenge for the human organism. It's unlike anything else that a child experiences at the time they engage in it, and how well they come through it, formats their brain.
Right.
For self-reflexivity, for critical self-reflection, for interface with all kinds of information. There's a lot of other pieces to it. I'm trying to oversimplify it or make a bullet in one spot and say that it covers anything, goes too far beyond that. But there's something about this and the way in which reading in proficiency correlates with so many academic and social difficulties and expenses and so forth, that runs because the reading thing, the process of learning to read, affects people so much more deeply than acquiring the other utility skills.
Right.
Comparatively superficial. It's
right.
Like, our whole constitution and organization is driven from the inside out to become language abled.
Right.
People with half a brain can do it. Language related stuff is considered so fundamental to our organism. This is an extension of that, and some reason children don't have difficulty with this.
Well, hence the use of the term code.
Yeah.
Cracking the code, understanding the code.
Which is somewhat misleading, in that with most codes you go, okay, now I see this connects to this, this connects to this.
Right.
I got it.
Right. It's a pretty complex code.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's a code we wouldn't let any machine run.
Right. Yeah, and I think kids early on, when they experience failure and they don't begin to acquire some of the tools that the rest of us perhaps take for granted, kind of think of themselves as non-readers. That's not part of who I am. A colleague of mine told me a pretty fascinating story about a guy in prison who was a non-reader but who was learning to read, was working with a tutor, and the tutor was reading the letters from home that he was getting from his wife. And the guy, the inmate was saying, you can read these, but look, there may be some real spicy stuff in here from my wife, some real endearing stuff, and I don't know if I want you to hear that. So let me cover your ears while you're reading it to me so you can't hear it. And the tutor said, well, I'm going to be reading it. And he started explaining to the guy. He said, no, I want to cover your ears. I don't want you to hear it. And I think what it revealed was this kind of profound misunderstanding about what reading's all about and about how we acquire language and how we use language. And this was a young adult. This wasn't a kid.
That's a great story. In fact, the last time we talked, you were full of great stories. So I remember that.
Did I tell that story last time?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay.
We've collected a lot of stories of what this, how people conceptualize, internalize their difficulty with this. But for the most part, whether it's the better bad than dumb, or it's the I'm a non-reader, or reading's not important, or I'm not smart.
Right.
These are all, in our other language, we'd say shame aversions.
Mm-hmm.
These are all ways of pushing off the feeling that they would have if they didn't push this off.
Right.
Given how they're able to perform in this space.
Right. It's kind of their explanation for who they are. And of course we can rationalize and say, well, of course they shouldn't feel that way. We'll do something to them to make them better. And oftentimes the roots are deep and the experience has been long and relatively painful.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about, just like reading itself is an automatic preconscious assembly, creating this virtual reality experience. Once we develop an effective version down at that level of automation, we're never going to know what we don't know.
Right.
It's going to steer us away. It's like whatever, I mean, it takes a pretty sophisticated adult to say, I'm really ashamed of myself here. I think I'm going to learn into why.
Right. We don't do that. No, we run the other direction.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Are you familiar with Jimmy Santiago Baca? No. I don't know. We must not have talked about him. He's an award-winning poet and author. And we had him come to a conference we sponsored last June in Denver. And the guy didn't learn to read until he was maybe 19 as a young adult in the Arizona prison system. He's one of those kids who experienced a lot of failure early in his life, and abandonment by his parents, living with a grandmother who went blind, and then was in an orphanage, and then in juvenile corrections, and and then kind of got into drugs and all kinds of trouble. And he writes in his autobiography that kind of books were the enemy. He really hated them because they were used as a way to kind of divide and separate, and he has become this incredibly gifted poet, writer, orator. And he speaks with such eloquence. But it's a great way to think about kind of the process. And he's one of the lucky ones that was very bright, and that for some reason kind of a little help from a tutor, some curiosity. I think he said the first book he ever owned he stole. He stole it from a volunteer who came into the prison, and then he got interested in reading it. It's like, what is this? I mean, it was a college text that he had stolen. So
it's very reminiscent of the opening introduction section of John Steinbeck's The Knights of King Arthur.
I'm not familiar with that book.
Very few people are, but John Steinbeck, you could have just taken his words right there. He grew up thinking words, books, they were this evil force.
Wow.
That was just terrorizing him. Until he found an old 500-year-old manuscript of King Arthur. And it was written in the Old English. For some reason that clicked. That
clicked for him.
And opened him up.
Wow.
He came to think that learning to read was the most difficult thing a human being ever does. And do it alone.
Interesting.
Went on to be a poet.
Oh yeah.
Writer of great.
Oh, wonderful writer. One of our greatest.
How many what can we say about the juvenile justice system? How many children are in it?
Oh gosh, in excess of 100,000 kids on any given day are committed in committed long-term juvenile correctional facilities across the country. Of that number, about half, less than half, are there for crimes against persons. The rest, property crimes, contempt of court, things like that. But one thing that's, I don't want to say universal, but that's incredibly common among those youngsters is school failure. School failure, retention and grade, a history of prior special ed services. Anywhere from about a third to a half of all kids that are locked up have previously been identified and served in special education. That's real common. Girls tend to be a little more competent, girls that are locked up, than boys that are locked up. Of course, there's a whole lot more boys locked up than girls. Just commenting about the adequacy of services once kids do get locked up. Since 1977, there's been in excess of 20 class action suits across the country alleging failure of the systems to provide adequate education services, including special education services to incarcerated kids. I guess one of the real focuses of our work is kind of getting systems to ensure that the schools for incarcerated kids meet the same standards that the public schools do. It's ironic that the state thinks it's appropriate to deprive kids of liberty because they're fearful, or to punish, or maybe to provide an opportunity to rehabilitate kids. But at the same token, they don't require that schools, in many states, that schools meet the same standards.
It's strange to think that the juvenile justice system would actually be an extension of special education.
Well, you know, it's music to my ears. I mean, in a sense, you think, well, a lot of these kids probably should have been diverted and should not have been locked up because in many cases there's this connection between their disabling condition and their delinquent behavior. These are kids who don't readily retain newly presented information, easily distracted, easily confused. They've experienced school failure. And so, we respond to their failure, and we respond to their transgressions in the community by depriving them of liberty and by not providing them with the habilitative services that they need, including education, including reading. I was at a facility in a large metropolitan area about 5 or 6 years ago, monitoring and reviewing the education program, and things looked pretty good. But I had a couple of concerns, and I sat down with the principal and I said, "Well, where's your reading program? Where's your reading class for kids who are really struggling here?" And she said, "Well, these are high school. Most of these kids are high schoolers." She said, "We're happy if they can sit in science class and listen and kind of take it all in that way." And I said, "Well, some of these kids are reading first, second, third, fourth grade level." I said, "These kids are really struggling." And she said, "Well, we think that's just too stigmatizing. We don't do it that way." And I think that captured, at least for me, some of the attitudes that we have as adults towards kids who don't read. It's like, well, I guess they're just not going to read. We haven't been able to get through, and so we're going to give up. And I mean, there's not a lot of evidence, but there is a growing body of evidence that you can teach older adolescents who've experienced lots of failure. You can teach them how to read, but you have to be focused. It's got to be small, group, or individualized. You gotta work hard to overcome those negative feelings that they have about acknowledging that they have trouble. You got to help them deal with, as you say, the shame associated with years of failure, and not being able to respond when their peers do, not being able to bring home that good report card, when maybe their siblings have. So yeah, there's a lot of baggage there that kids wrestle with.
There's quite a growing body of evidence that a significant part of the attention disorders and like the conversation with Wendell, most of the children that we say have learning disabilities, we realize they have learning disabilities in relation to reading.
Right.
There's 4% or so, 5% maybe, that have some, what we think is neurobiological, but clearly the rest of the people that are having difficulty because of the environments that they've been learning in.
Right.
So when we talk about educational failure, fundamentally we're talking about reading and proficiency.
Right. Right.
I want to connect that as tightly as you're willing to.
Sure. We talked earlier about the importance of reading is really a kind of a core skill that we all have, and a skill that is associated with so much of what we do as adults. It really, it provides access to employment, leisure, all kinds of things. And, kids not connecting and kids not getting those skills early on, through learning disabilities that may go undetected, at least initially, is really a key part of the problem. We talked a little bit about.
I can't use it. Sorry.
Okay.
The deeds office?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
So you're the hammer. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, you feel good about that, don't you?
Sure.
Oh, let's see. Yeah, she's pretty mal. Let's see, where were we? We were talking about reading.
What I'm particularly trying to do is to understand how much of the dimension we call the juvenile justice, that whole realm, is connected to things, something, a kind of self-relationship pathology that's developing because of what's not working for them in school, which has its root in this coming into reading, like this.
Right. Well, a question often asked is why is there such a high percentage of kids in the juvenile justice system with learning disabilities, emotional behavioral problems, mental retardation? Why is it so much higher than one finds in the general population among school-age children? And there's several theories. There's not a lot of strong empirical evidence. There's some associations that we can look at. We talked a little bit about school failure as a common denominator. There's a susceptibility theory that suggests that kids who experience school failure, who haven't learned to read, drift towards other kids who've experienced those same kinds of things, kind of the drift towards delinquent peers. And they get a lot more kind of positive feedback from their peers who have experienced similar failure than they do from the school system and from their peers who are doing well and kind of getting connected. Beyond the idea of susceptibility is this notion of differential treatment. And I think what captures the essence of a differential treatment theory is the notion that kids with disabilities don't necessarily commit more delinquent acts than their peers. However, when they do get in trouble, they're much more likely to receive a punitive fit in the juvenile delinquency or juvenile justice system. That is, when they encounter a cop who questions them about their behavior, when they come into juvenile hall and they face some questions from the prosecuting attorney, when they're in court and we respond to questions from the judge, they're not able to articulate and express themselves well the way other kids are who are much more competent and capable academically. So, they can't give good explanations, good credible explanations about where they were and why they were doing what they were doing. And whether they're guilty or not, whether they're involved, as the juvenile justice system likes to call it, involved or not is really secondary to this notion that they really appear to be hiding something. They really appear to be culpable because they don't look you in the eye. They don't give a good explanation for what's going on. And, you see the juvenile court officials saying, I just don't trust him. I think he was involved.
So the bottom line is they're not as good as liars.
They can't lie well. Yeah, well, I mean, whether they're not as good liars or whether they just can't adequately account for their behavior. And so we can...
Except in the case where the delinquency is about the same, but one's able to talk their way through it, the other one's not.
Well, let me be personal about it. I mean, when I was a kid, I got in trouble. And the few times, most guys did. And when the police came around, we could look them right in the eye. No, sir. Yes, ma'am. They'd say, okay, just watch it. You guys, it's 10:30. You guys really ought to be home. Yes, sir. And if, we see the squad car, if you start running, or if they say, what's your name? And you're so nervous and you can't give a credible explanation. You say, why don't you get in the squad car? We'll come on down to the station. We'll talk about it.
But here again, what we're describing is how their affective relationship with themselves is turbulating their ability to be coherent rather than just the mechanics of the manipulation.
Right. It's not just the mechanics. It's not just being able to explain who you are, but it's being able to kind of present oneself and feel good about that presentation of self in the presence of the police or the courts or any authority figure. It's a there's I come back to that notion that most of our analyses kind of point to child failure as opposed to systemic failure within the schools, within the juvenile courts. We're much better identifying the kids who fail and the topography of their behavior than we are at identifying the systems.
Yeah, I mean, our hope with what we're up to is that, I mean, there's just too much at stake here to keep this mess going that way.
Right. Whether you care at all about kids, if you care about taxes, if you care about safety, if then you want the kids that are growing up to become productive tax-paying citizens, providing them inadequate education services, allowing a very large percentage of them to experience failure, allowing a large percentage of them to encounter the juvenile delinquency system and then to kind of be pushed into it as far as they can is really so short-sighted. But if we think of it in terms of prevention, prevention's not an easy thing to measure, and prevention is not glitzy. It's a lot easier to put into place an anti-bullying program, a violence reduction program. Or to target kids who failed and then try to fix them, as opposed to say, well, what is it about this community? What is it about the system that served or didn't serve these kids that really needs to be fixed? Why does our analysis always come down to, well, let's fix these kids? Let's take a good look at the system that we've created and say, well, how is it failing kids? Let's take a look at ourselves and our systems.
Yeah. No wonder they think something's wrong with them.
Right.
It's the context that we're creating.
Exactly. A couple more anecdotes. In some juvenile justice systems that either have developed or have begun to develop good education programs, you talk to kids and you interview teachers. And I remember one situation. I was interviewing a teacher, and during the interview, a kid comes by and he says, "Mr. Jones, is everything okay?" Basically, he's saying, who's this outsider? You're an important person. You're helping us out here. Is this guy messing with you? That's I think an interesting response from a kid. Another one is in a system. Actually, this is in the Arizona Department of Juvenile Corrections. They have this intake process where they assess kids' abilities and aspirations early on, within the first 3 or 4 weeks of admittance, and then they work with the child to look and see whether he or she has the skills to fulfill jobs that are consistent with those aspirations. And when there's a gap there, they say, okay, let's come up with a plan. And that plan, at least theoretically, is the blueprint for the kid's education program. They also use education performance as part of this exit review prior to release. So within a few weeks of getting there, the kids all understand that how well they're doing in school is something that's going to be reviewed by a team that's going to be making decisions about how soon they can leave the facility. So it kind of changes everything. Instead of school being something they've got to do because it's there, they're interested in figuring out what they can get out of school because they know that somebody's interested in how they're doing in school. But not all systems operate that way.
We've been working with some people at Goodwill that function that way on adult literacy. They assess, kind of, what do you really want to do? Where would you like to be? And they build a stairway.
Interesting.
So the stairway's coming from their own intention about where they want to be.
Right.
And then you add that into the situation like this and say, and plus how your progress on the stairway is connected to when you get out of here.
Right. That's powerful.
Got really powerful alignment of intrinsic motivation and pedagogy for transformation.
Right. It's the perspective is, we're here to help you. You're interested in doing these things. Here's what we know about you. Let's put a plan together. And so instead of being top down, I know kids, I know what's best for you. Sit down, young man. It's here's what we know about you. Let's put a plan together. What are you interested in working on first? what are you interested in doing next?
Excellent. You mentioned 100,000 kids were kind of in long term.
Right.
How many kids overall are caught in the net?
Gosh, in any given year, I review those statistics periodically, and I just don't know. I know there's over 1 million people in the country that are incarcerated, over 1 million people, and if we add into that people on probation and parole and things like that, the number swells even higher. I know in California, for example, the number of people in the Department of Corrections is in excess of 150,000. And I think we're all pretty well aware of the fact that rates of incarceration really vary from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I think those just reflect the ways that communities decide to respond to troublesome
Are you
behavior.
familiar with the study that a number of people have said this? Leslie Moreau, president of the International Reading Association, Russ Whitehurst, assistant secretary of U.S. Department of Education, Reed Lyon, have made the statement that there are states that actually determine how to build and manage and extend their prison systems based on
Third grade reading scores.
Yeah.
That's like that's an urban legend. The Kentucky Fried Rat story, or the concept of urban legends. I really think it's come to that level. One of my colleagues cited that in a paper that's on our website, and we get a couple calls a year. It's been alleged that the California Department of Corrections uses that as a gauge. People in the California Department of Corrections have called us and said, "Where did you get that information? We want to talk to the people that use that as an indicator." But I mean, it's pretty flashy. And literally about once a year, there'll be a flurry of phone calls, and we'll try to connect people, and my colleague at the University of Kentucky who cited that, he says, "I'm not sure where I got that from." And so I'll call back to people in California and I'll talk to them. And I do work in California with the DOC. And I've never talked to anyone in kind of planning who says, "Yeah, this is what we do." I've heard lots of people say that, but I've never heard anyone connect the dots and say, "This is." I mean,
Okay. All right.
so I mean, I would use that information cautiously.
Okay.
I mean,
when these other people say it, it's not us saying it.
oh, exactly.
So that's one of the ways we process what we don't say, what we do.
Exactly.
But we do get called on that, and it is quite a powerful myth, referring to implicitly the strong correlation between these two.
Oh yeah, I mean they're incredibly powerful. They're incredibly powerful. If you school failure, race, and disability are probably three of the most powerful kind of factors associated with vulnerability to the juvenile or criminal justice system. You put those three together, and it's pretty powerful. Pretty powerful.
Yeah.
About 10 minutes.
Good. Thank you for keeping track of that. You were telling me about stories of adults that you encountered that were hiding. You used the phrase "dying to learn," but hiding for a group of teenage boys in some facility where they had to sneak out to go be part of some kind of
Sure. Actually, that was one of my colleagues here at the university, Will Drakeford. Will conducted a study at Oak Hill a few years ago. It was his dissertation. And he had, I think it was a single subject research design. So he had 6 17-year-olds who were reading below the 10th percentile on standardized measures of reading performance. They were all special ed eligible and received special ed services. They were all incarcerated. And he kind of set up an experimental tutoring program, and I think it was 3 evenings a week, one-on-one with a tutor. And after several weeks, other boys at the facility were sneaking out of their cottages at night and coming down to the school where the tutoring was taking place because they wanted to participate. And I mean, it was one of those unplanned kind of events or unanticipated findings. But I think it provided some very strong evidence that not only at the end of his study did he demonstrate some pretty marked increases in fluency and comprehension among the kids that he was working with, but also that kind of among the kids in general, they wanted to learn to read. And they thought that whoever was doing the teaching, the word was out that they were good people, and they were willing to help you. And this was on the kids' own time. They were taking time out from watching TV or participating in recreation activities in the evening to come over and to be tutored. So, I think that's a strong evidence that if you do it right, kids will come to it.
There was a phrase, and I can't remember the details of it. I don't have the transcript of our conversation with us, about other ways that juveniles rationalize away the shame. Does that ring a bell?
No, I'm just trying to think of some. Well, I can share with you. There's a reading methodology broadly called direct instruction. I'm sure some of the folks have talked a little bit about direct instruction.
I had 6 hours of interviews with
Russ Gersten or people or
Siegfried.
Siegfried Engelmann. Okay, I know of him. I don't know him personally. He's a real character, as I understand. Well, anyways, there's a lot of good evidence associating direct instruction with some very positive outcomes for kids, particularly disadvantaged kids. And so one of the things that I support when I go to places is kind of direct instruction, small d, small I, methods, explicit instruction for kids who've experienced failure, where you kind of break things down and you say, well, okay, what kind of skills do they need? Is it word attack? Is it comprehension? Is it vocabulary? Is it some combination of those things? Let's put together a program tailored to a kid's needs. And so I'll go to facilities and I'll see a really good reading teacher doing a wonderful lesson with a group of 3 or 4 guys. And it might be corrective reading, direct instruction. And she's got the words on the board and she's working through the nonsense syllables and the CVC words and things like that. And after the lesson's over, I'll come over and I'll talk to the guys and I'll say, hey, what are you guys doing this for? Kind of playing ignorant. And they'll say, hey, we're learning to read. And they'll get a little bit defensive. They'll say, and I'll say, well, tell me about the teacher. They'll say, she's really good. She knows what she's doing. And they'll really talk in very positive terms about what they're learning to do. And it's exciting. And it's exciting. And I wish every teacher could see that, because these are the kids that people have written off and said, we worked with them, and it just didn't work. And the instruction was not direct enough or explicit enough. And the kids didn't work, didn't learn.
It wasn't a fit.
Yeah, wasn't a good fit for that particular child.
We're almost out of time. Is there anything that, as we close and wrap up, that touches on this connection between the code, children, and your workspace that we haven't touched on?
Wow, this has been pretty broad-ranging. Well, I think, I don't know if you captured my comments earlier about this, but I think we can't underestimate the costs associated with reading failure in the early grades and its associations with so many negative life outcomes. Incarceration and involvement with the juvenile delinquency system is just one of those negative outcomes, but it's also probably one of the most dire. I think people think that, kids need to learn a lesson. Kids get sent away for a while. That kind of straightens them out. I think that's kind of a myth too. For a lot of kids, it's a really painful process. And some of them don't come out any more competent than when they go in. I guess my hope would be that states and politicians take seriously this notion that's written into most of their state constitutions that they have an obligation to educate all children. And just because kids get locked up and have experienced failure in the past doesn't mean that they get a half a loaf and that their education program is in many ways inferior to what their own sons and daughters would experience in the public schools. So I guess that's it.
Also, perhaps maybe we should take a closer look at how our education has actually pushed these children into that situation.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, the idea that you keep doing more of the same for the kids that have experienced. Can I take a crack at NCLB?
Yeah, go.
Okay. Well, just one thought about No Child Left Behind, and that is, I mean, the concept is a good one, I think, the idea of high standards for all kids. But what the federal government has done is taken a little bit of money and spread it incredibly thinly across all school districts, great and small, school districts with serious problems, as well as school districts that need that are doing fine, and which many of the kids are doing well. I really think that money ought to be targeted on the kids in the school districts that are experiencing the greatest challenges.
I was part of SB 501 in California.
Okay.
Which was a version before NCLB.
And accountability.
But it was all about, how to shift the resources and institutional incentives.
Are we all done?